And we are live, April 10th, 2022. Show number 5, the Sunday MMA show. Coming to you after UFC 273, Volkanovski versus the Korean Zombie. Quite a night of fights. I would say every bit as good as we could have hoped for. Although pretty different in a lot of ways. A lot of the fights played out more dramatically, and certainly some outcomes were a surprise. But even in the fights that didn't look exactly as we thought they would on paper, I felt the effort from all the fighters, the intensity, the focus. I don't know exactly what it was. I guess that's what I would pinpoint as the true unique thing about this card. Not just the fights were good. I think we go back a couple weeks to UFC London, and those were all bangers. It was a different kind of energy. And this card didn't have that. It had a whole mix, almost a confused energy. Energy for energy's sake. You heard the crowd contradicting itself. They couldn't have popped any bigger for Chimaev when he walked out. And then by the end, they're booing him. And I'm sure it's different segments of the crowd, perhaps. And undoubtedly, people would have been impressed by the Burns approach to the fight and his gameness and all of that. So I'm sure he won over some fans. But to flip-flop like that, a lot of interesting energy in the air in the arena. But I did think uniquely the fighters from the opening fight right through to the main event with Volkanovski and the Korean Zombie, you had a very specific and intense focus from all the fighters, almost a self-awareness. And I'm not sure where that's coming from. Maybe that's something we can talk about as time goes on. But we are here. Welcome to the live stream. Thanks for being in the chat. If things go well, I'll be taking calls later in the show. I'll put up the number so you can have that and be ready if you want to call in. And as always, if you have comments or questions or something you just have to get off your chest during the week, this isn't my personal number. This is just for the show. So you can call and leave a message anytime you want. I will start doing segments and adding them into episodes where I pull questions from this phone line, 206-276-8384. Generic Villa fan, Navid Drew, Martin A., good to see you. Zen, good to see you as well. Just waiting for a few more people to filter in. Starting in earnest. But we will start from the top. Work our way through the card, jump back and forth, grab some questions from the chat, and eventually grab some phone calls should they come to be. The main event, Alexander Volkanovski versus the Korean Zombie. And remember, this one came together because Max Holloway had an injury, had to pull out. And interesting enough, Max ended up at least hinting at the fact that he could make the fight and wanted to be a backup to the fight, which would have really only confused things greatly. So I thought that was good that the UFC didn't take him up on that. There were some thoughts early on that maybe the Zombie wasn't the perfect person to step in, but the guy is a legend. Going back to those fights, the first one in the WEC against Leonard Garcia, and then rematched Leonard in the UFC. I mean, the Korean Zombie goes way back. He's a legend, and you heard it in the crowd. There was a lot of support for TKZ, and rightly so. The fight ends in the fourth round, 45 seconds into the fourth round. It could have ended sooner than that. I think that's pretty solid consensus there. In fact, at the very beginning of the fourth round, as Volkanovski's walking out, they sort of stop at the center, and Volk asks him, "Are you sure?" And the broadcast crew couldn't quite pick up what was being said. Anik just mentions, well, there's a conversation going on, but that's what the conversation was. Volk asking Chan Sung Jung if you truly want to go on. And good for Volk, the sportsmanship. Of course, you don't expect Zombie to say, no, I'm not going to fight. He's there to win. He's got some of that Tony Ferguson in him. Some of those guys who just will not quit, will not go down even. And thankfully, Herb Dean found his leadership and took it into his own hands after the fourth round started off looking even worse than the end of the third round. Stops the fight, as I said, at 45 seconds into the fourth round, capping a not just dominant, but sterling, no pun intended, an actually sterling performance from Volkanovski. And my one concern going into this fight, let me know what you think, tell me in the chat. I've been very much on the train for Volkanovski since going back to the first interview I heard with him. It was before he made his debut in the UFC. And I thought, okay, this guy's a little different. Now, who knows if he's a little self-deluded or just hasn't matched up against the true talent of the biggest promotions. But you could tell this guy in Volkanovski had a different mentality as far as the type of responsibility he put on himself. He's not an excuse maker. He's not a guy who's ever going to look for a way out. And with an athletic background like he has, it goes a long way. If you can, I tweeted about Vince Pichel earlier in the week and said this guy has all the intangibles you could ever hope to want in a fighter, which is true. Volkanovski is the same thing. He has every single intangible: heart, cardio, will, focus. The list goes on. Pretty much everything you can't measure with a computer or a stopwatch. This guy, he has it. But I was a little concerned with Volkanovski coming into the fight because he'd really shifted his persona. And if you caught any of the media leading up to the fight, it wasn't that he was necessarily more confident, but he was way more open to talking about how he was going to dominate, how he wanted the finish, and that these guys just aren't on my level. And I always see that as a red flag when you see somebody who's been so consistent and then all of a sudden they shift how they're presenting themselves. It made sense from Volkanovski that he would do this because he's been sort of toiling away in the UFC. It's his third title defense, and he's not getting the kind of respect that, say, a Kamaru Usman is getting. And Volkanovski's done every bit the hard work and arguably more than Izzy or Usman or some of the other champions, especially when you don't have a premier John Jones level champion right now. I think the UFC is in a very good position in that the vast majority of their champions represent the brand and their divisions very well. I think Volkanovski really wanted to put his stamp on the idea that, no, I'm not just a guy that's going to be a footnote somewhere between Max Holloway and Aldo and sort of be lost in the dustbin of history. He's really trying to put his mark. And I think putting himself out there and being a little more forward with that perspective, with his own expectations, well, there's more risk because it's akin to bragging. It's akin to that level of self-belief bleeds over into sounding overconfident at times. And that puts all the more pressure. It's almost like trash talk at that point. It's the most respectful trash talk you can imagine. He was always quick to qualify any of his statements that complete respect for the zombie, but I'm just on a different level. And he did show that. And Volkanovski's game has rounded together very well. And he did what he needed to do. It's a long-standing rule of my own that when a fighter, whether a champion or anywhere on the card, if you're favored by more than 500, minus 500, you need to pretty much completely control the fight and finish it. You need to put a stamp on that performance. And sometimes as a fighter, you can't control the odds, but more times than not, when you're that large of a favorite, there's a reason for it. And Volkanovski did what he needed to do. Nearly perfect performance, in my opinion. Let's go to the chat here and see what's going on. Drew says, Hammy slightly exposed last night. Chimaev, he means. Yeah, I don't know if exposed, and we'll get into that when we get to the featured event of the main card of the two non-title fights. I actually thought that, and I'll talk a little bit about it, that Chimaev came out, and it was so interesting. In the beginning, even before he came into the UFC, people really wanted to compare him to Khabib. And it didn't take much of checking the guy out for me to say, this guy couldn't be more different. And you're going to miss something perhaps pretty cool if you compare him too much to Khabib. These guys are pretty much opposites in the way they approach things. The fact that they both have unblemished records, come from a similar region of the world, that's about where it stops. Khabib wore his religiosity on his sleeve, and we saw last night Chimaev fighting in Ramadan. That's something that Khabib said was impossible. Couldn't be done. I think there are so many things that Chimaev does, and I've been saying it for some time now, that I do believe that maybe as much as 10 or 20% of Khabib's reason for leaving the UFC is Chimaev, because eventually those two were going to have to fight. And it's not that I don't think Khabib believed he could beat him, but you don't avoid fighting wrestlers your whole career and then go and pick a fight with a much larger wrestler than yourself right at the end of it. So I would say no, Chimaev didn't get exposed from his walkout until he got into the cage. And then if you caught on the broadcast, as Burns was walking out, Chimaev was actually sitting on top of the cage. To me, that was a little over the top, in that he's really getting outside of himself. When he first was walking out, Chimaev, from the back, he was confident. You could tell he was happy. And it reminded me a little bit of that early second, third, fourth fight in the career of Conor McGregor, where a guy is so extremely confident. The kind of confident you can only be when you don't know what you don't know. And that type of confidence can be flipped around on you and become overconfident. And we saw perhaps a little bit of that at Chimaev. More than anything, Khamzat deciding to pretty much stay on the feet. And even when he had Gilbert down a couple times, not getting into the guard, using his ground and pound, I'm sure some of that was at least slight concern. What's Gilbert going to do? Very dangerous jiu-jitsu black belt. More than anything, I believe Khamzat didn't want to put on a boring performance. And he would have had to be very controlling. He would have basically had to fight the Khabib game plan, where you do nothing but control position for the first 2 or 3 rounds, or at least the first round and a half, 2 rounds. Maybe if you get your opponent tired enough, you can then fish around very gingerly for a submission or something. And that's not been the brand that Khamzat has sold us. I mean, if you think about a Justin Gaethje who came in guns blazing, saying, I don't even care about championships. I'm going to be the most exciting, most violent fighter in the UFC, in the world. Then he came in and proved that. It didn't matter that he lost some fights. And part of his quick rise and fan acceptance and jumping on the train for Justin Gaethje was the fact that he promised to fight. He didn't promise to fight and then go out there and find ways to utilize rule sets to win a match. He didn't say, I'm going to be a competitor, I'm going to be a sportsman. He said, I'm going to be a fighter. And that is what Khamzat has shown us and told us in the build-up, which is smart. I think he's moved into at least the 4th place in the UFC as far as being able to move the needle, generate interest for the entire company, and specifically the card that he's on. Dana was saying all week that the Burns-Chimaev fight was doing 7 to 8 times the traffic that either of the title fights were doing. And that's mostly Chimaev. It's not completely Chimaev because Burns was such a good foil. He's a number 2 guy. He's an absolute legit contender. Fought Usman. Ended up not going his way, clearly, but had his moments early in that fight. You don't get any more legit as far as a test than what Chimaev got in Burns. And that helped. You know it's not a hype show when a guy's coming in and fighting basically one of the best guys he can fight, if not the best guy he can fight, that isn't the champ. A couple more questions. Danson from the UK. I'm good to see you, brother. R2G2 says, I thought Sterling should have got a 10-8 for round 2. Do you agree? That was close. Definitely not round 3. Round 2, I think you could give it to him, especially if you're under the supposedly newer rules. And I don't know if Florida is or not. If it's the old rules, then no, probably not a 10-8. Under the new rules where you're supposed to give liberal application of 10-8s, then yeah, that would make sense. And under that scenario, I would have the fight as a draw, because I thought first round, Jan wins, but there was so little action that's the danger. That's the danger when you play that game. And Jan doesn't start fast. He likes to calculate and all of that. But he didn't expect to get caught with Aljo on his back for 2 rounds. And he just simply couldn't get out of it. I suppose if he would have tried a little more dramatically, a little more dynamically to get out, he might have been able to do it. But then you're putting yourself in a real problematic situation, because Aljo I would say is just about the best. Certainly at the lighter weights. Maybe Maya back in the day, but at the lighter weights, Aljo might be the very best at capitalizing on the smallest scramble mistake to get your back. And kudos to Jan for being able to fight off the pressure. The funny thing about Sterling maybe getting a 10-8 in the second round was he was pretty much content to hang on the back, lay there, consistently work for angles with his arms. He was taking the slow and steady approach, waiting for Jan to make a mistake. And then Jan hit some reverse punches that must have hurt Sterling. And he's a guy that never likes to get hit. But in that position, it seemed to really sting him a little bit. And that's when Sterling got quite aggressive in the second round. Actually landed really nice ground and pound of his own. Not ground and pound, but from behind. Landed nice shots of his own. Really turned up the energy. So in a weird way, Jan might have put himself in the position of giving Sterling that much more reason to fight hard in that second round by catching him with a couple of those reverse shots. Matthew says, big love from Oxford, England. Thanks, my friend. John Wayne, what's up, Alpaca? John Wayne asks, why did people write off Sterling? I felt like he performed well in the first fight and is a better grappler. If he went into a game plan, which he did, he was always going to be a problem for Jan. Well, I don't know why everybody else or why so many people were dismissing Sterling. And quite honestly, there were a minority of voices from what I heard from the media, the pundits, and the combat sports thinkers that were starting to point to, well, you know, Sterling did have success in that first round. I will say for myself, I didn't give Sterling much of a chance beyond, and I think this is what I wrote on Twitter, that early on, if he can distract Jan with the leg kicks, create a scramble, then he's going to be dangerous. I didn't think about the fact that Sterling would be so disciplined to not give up position once he had the back. I thought he might, I assumed that Sterling would be a little desperate, and as time was running down at the end of the round, he would really push to try to get the finish, thinking that was how his only path to victory. But Sterling invested himself in that game plan, and it worked out for him. The thing that Sterling did is he put himself in the position to win, and he did his best to completely be out of the parts of the fight where he was in true danger. And that's not the easiest thing in the world to do, quite honestly. There we go, Aljamain. When you're a fighter like Aljo, it was about halfway through the first round, and just to give the facts, Sterling and Jan fought to a split decision, two judges giving it to Sterling 48-47, one to Peter Yan 48-47. Sterling came out to a lot of boos. I think a lot of that was just the sentiment that he played up the illegal blow and that he could have continued in that fight. And Sterling was put in a real tough situation with that. Who knows how hurt he was, but Jan opened the door, and a little bit like Anthony Smith against John Jones. Jones hits him with the illegal shot. Now, the Jones shot was not as direct and egregious as what Jan landed on Sterling. If it had been, then I think Smith has a real choice to make. And I think there's nothing wrong with Sterling, even if he made the decision to fall on the side of caution and say, look, I don't know how hurt I am. I was hurt before this. I was tired before this. I was frustrated before this. Now I can't imagine myself going back in trying to finish the fight. Well, that's Jan's fault. It's not on Sterling to help his opponent out in that situation. It's unfortunate for everybody involved, including the UFC, including the fans. But it's, when you have two humans competing at the highest level, crazy stuff's going to happen. And so I didn't like that Sterling got so much grief, but he then leaned into it quite a bit and made himself a bit of a heel, which is one way to handle it. You make the stress sort of fake if you put on a fake response. If you take it over the top, it takes you out of the zone of sincerely considering people and their opinions of you. And they're all strangers. They don't pay Aljo's bills. They're not there at 5 a.m. when he gets up to run. They're not there when he's suffering through a weight cut. So, yeah, some fans have an opinion, but at the end of the day, Aljo did what he had to do to get to this fight. I certainly think having the surgery and the weight cut under control a little better did a lot to also put him in the position where he could win. I didn't see him winning 3 of the 5 rounds, but that first round was so low volume that, again, Jan just put an awful lot of trust in the judges. And I think Sterling was also having some low-key, sort of under-the-radar success with his body shots. Because even in the 4th round where Jan was dominating and in the 5th, he wasn't able to get much volume going because he couldn't tell if Sterling was going for a takedown or if he was going to kick him in the breadbasket or duck in and throw hooks to the body. And Jan didn't look real steady in those last 2 frames. I'm sure all the grappling and surviving he had to do in 2 and 3 didn't help that situation. So from the vantage of sitting on the couch watching this thing, I thought Jan did enough to win. But looking at the fight in even just the smallest amount of detail, to me, you have to respect what Sterling was able to do. Particularly when you think, look, if Sterling didn't, if he was unable to put the fight where he got it, if he was unable to be on his back for the majority of 2 full rounds, if he was unable to move away from the pressure of Jan, if he would have been forced to stand in the pocket even a little bit, he's outmatched, outgunned, and it's not even close. He has virtually no shot of winning at that point. So he did the one thing, or the 2 things, if you will, the way his movement, which at times was even running, but he was able to do those things to preserve himself and allow the fight to continue so that he could, if the moment presented itself, grab the positions that would work for him. And he did that. And to me, you can't criticize Sterling for that. And yet, to me, you have to call him the champ. He won. He put himself in those positions. And 2 of the 3 judges agreed that his performance was that much better than Peter Yan. Yan will be back. He had a pretty lousy game plan, and the fact he kept giving up his back shows that he's got a lot of room for improvement. Okay. Checking out some questions. Adam Watts, thank you for the donation, my friend. Hamzat's public image has been a vessel for fans' imaginations. that image is a mirage. Last night the mirage vanished. He became human. Agree. Well, I think that's a little... It's a little more dramatic, a little more... I think there's another way to read it. I think if you look at... I think you're right in the first half that people were able to project. When you have a largely unknown in a thing, it allows people to project their thoughts, ideas, hopes onto it. And that's one of the things that makes sports so compelling and why sports fans generate so much money for athletes and sports leagues, because we project our own hopes onto the team or athlete. So that definitely is going to happen. I think that Khamzat came into the fight thinking he was going to his own coronation, that he pretty much just had to show up, do what he's done in every fight, every practice, every sparring session, and that's inflict his will without serious resistance. And I don't think he's training with losers. He clearly isn't. And he's fought the competition that was appropriate up to this point in his career. He's not ducking people. But as I said earlier, you don't know what you don't know. And so Chimaev came in feeling like he was going to be crowned king, even sitting on the throne, if you will, the edge of the top of the cage as Burns walks in. But I think it ended up being a bit of an existential battle for his soul in Chimaev. He didn't win the crown, but he ended up winning something more important and might allow him to win that crown, win the belt. And that's that Chimaev's own ideas about himself were in the balance in this fight. He felt he could beat anybody. He felt he could beat anybody at their own game, that his hands are as good as his grappling, that regardless of game plan, his sheer will, determination, strength, fate, I don't know if that's something he also believes in for himself, but his entire image of himself has been confirmed throughout his athletic career and his life, and the two are fairly inseparable. So Gilbert Burns providing a true vehicle of resistance, he was able to directly assault some of those ideas. Can Chimaev actually take a shot? Yeah, he can. He took some crazy shots, and we know Burns has got those bombs. And Chimaev had never been pushed. Another way that I was thinking about it after the fight was, you can train and you can do exercises, but until you get into a live fire situation, say militarily, until you're out there and you're taking damage and you're taking fire from the enemy, that's the first time that it becomes real to you that you're not impervious to the damage, to the dissolution, to the mental anguish that you see every other fighter having to deal with. And I thought at the very end that Chimaev sort of started to realize that. And guys like to say that, oh, I want to be challenged, I want to be in a war. But nobody really wants to be in a war, not in the moment. They want to be able to look back and say, yeah, I fought through all these things. But if you have the ability to go out there and just purely dominate, that's what most fighters are going to do. And I don't know how much of the fight swung on Chimaev wanting to prove his bona fides as a all-around martial artist, and to, quite honestly, distance himself from the Khabib comparison. I think Chimaev sees any comparison to Khabib as a little unsavory. He's not had the he's been fairly respectful, but he's also been quick to point out he's not my guy. We aren't buddies. I'm not his protege. So to lay on Gilbert for the first round or 2 rounds, I think he would have rather lost than be something other than what he believes himself to be. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying it, but I don't. Perhaps the mirage that fans held in their minds of what Chimaev could be, because you're never, if you're purely a fighter, meaning you're going to stand your ground and give your opponent the opportunity to fight you on their own terms, nobody comes out of that unscathed. Anderson Silva was the best ever at doing that. John Jones probably a close second. Most guys use very specific game plans to maximize their ability and minimize what their opponent can do. Think of GSP or a Khabib, the ultimate game planners. So the image that Chimaev was going to be some kind of a superhero or a cartoon action fighter, that was never going to happen. The only way he could have preserved that type of image is if he just wrestled and had a super heavy game plan focused approach to the fight. But he's a fighter. He's not just a sportsman or a competitor or an athlete. But yes, he became human, which in the end I think might make Chimaev better, because now he knows he's human. Now he knows he can be tired. Now he knows the number 2 guy in the world could take his best shots and could take his best grappling. So overall, I think that does a lot to help Chimaev. Okay, we'll look at a couple more questions here. Serge T. The Newt is doing well. I just talked to him yesterday. And you're from Northern Ontario. We talking Sudbury or where are you at? I did spend one crazy evening in Sudbury back in the day. Jesus Hernandez, good to see you, my friend. Okay. D2 says that he feels Jan was robbed. Sterling only had 2 for 22 takedown attempts. Yeah, I didn't know that stat. I wouldn't call it a robbery, but yeah, not... I would have given Jan the edge. To me, when you can look at a performance and see multiple places where the fighter could not just do better, but give attention to. Why was Jan re-engaging in the grappling when he didn't need to? That muddied the fight up. Nothing looks worse when you're being judged than the way Sterling acts after he gets hit. Anything that ever lands on Sterling, he ends up running away, kind of shielding his head at some point. You want to get him in that state where everything that hits him looks so dramatic and impactful. Jan had him in that state towards the end of the first round, but Sterling was able to recompose himself, get back out there, and attack his game plan and focus on the very narrow part of the fight that he had the potential to win, and he did that. D-Rest, you're right. Sterling didn't do anything of consequence while holding Jan on the ground, but it's one of those unwritten rules that you don't stand guys up if somebody has the back position. I completely disagree with Joe Rogan that if you have somebody down, it's the guy on the bottom's job to get up. No, because it's MMA, it's mixed martial arts, it's fighting. It's in the name of the organization. It's the Ultimate Fighting Championship. It's not grappling. It's not who can take fullest advantage of a loophole in the rules. To me, what's missing when people think about whether somebody should be stood up or not is that they think of just having the position as the same as the takedown. The takedown is scored as an advantage. But then once they're in the position, it doesn't matter who's on top or bottom based on the rule book. It's a static position. But that's not how Joe Rogan thinks about it, because he goes back to the days before there was time limits on rounds, and he's coming from a grappling mindset. The other guy who does a lot to sway people towards no stand-ups is Chael Sonnen. Well, not surprising with him, because being stood up was his worst nightmare. If you think about once it goes to the ground, that now it's a static position. Unless somebody is doing damage with strikes or advancing the position or threatening with submissions, then after a minimal amount of time, and I would say 30 seconds, 45 seconds, you stand them up. No different than you would do if they were against the cage, and no different that you should do if one guy is refusing to engage while you're standing up. If one guy is literally running away and refusing to engage, that's the same thing if you just have a dominant position and refuse to engage. So, we would need a better understanding and a better application from a firmer commission to be able to come in and really, so that everybody can understand, once you have this dominant position, you're now in a stalemate unless you are doing damage, unless you are advancing position, or at least trying to get submissions. And quite honestly, for the majority of the time that Sterling had Jan's back, he wasn't actually trying for a submission. He was trying and waiting for the opportunity to arise, but that's very different. Okay. Madra says, Peter Yan could have disengaged in the grappling when he had Aljo hurt in the 4th round and 5th, but he chose to hold on to Aljo and Yan. Was Yan tired? And was it low fight IQ? It definitely cost him. He could have won 10-8. That's what I was wondering, is what exactly was happening. I felt, and I intimated this earlier, that I think the pressure from grappling, and particularly the confusion that Jan was picking up in the reads later in the fight, he couldn't tell if Sterling was going to get him with a leg kick, a body kick, a takedown, or a fake takedown to some of those really nice body shots that Sterling was landing. I think they did have an effect. At the very least, it discombobulated Jan's ability to read what was happening in front of himself. And then I also think fatigue was a serious exacerbating factor. I think I wouldn't call it low fight IQ from Jan. I would say more that he probably needs a little more preparation in that what happens if the fight gets to this point and these things have happened. So maybe a little more strategic in the pregame planning. Drew says Hamzat looks beatable. Yeah, for sure, he did. But he also showed that he could come through and overcome pretty rough adversity. And that does bring us to Gilbert Burns versus Hamzat Chimaev. And I thought fight of the night, clearly one of the greater fights we've seen in quite some time. Ends up going 29-28, a across all three scorecards for Chimaev. It was also telling to me just how electric the crowd was for Chimaev. Over the last few fight cards, we've seen pretty much any fighter with any sort of ties to Russia being at least received coolly, if not outright booed, where Chimaev didn't get that response. And part of that is that Chimaev doesn't see himself as a Russian. He doesn't call himself a Russian. He doesn't come out to the Russian flag. These are all things that are very different than what Khabib did. But Khabib had other political reasons for doing that. Chimaev, he's a Chechen. And now he's also Swedish. And he's proud of those places. And I think that helps, that he's not seen as being part of a badly acting regime. One thought I had coming out of this fight was the biggest loser between in the fight with Burns and Chimaev is actually Leon Edwards. Not that you immediately are going to give Chimaev a title fight off this, but Burns looks so good, and this was the exact opposite kind of a fight that you'll ever see Edwards in. I do feel bad that Edwards has, not been given a title shot, but he's also a guy who doesn't go out there and make it impossible to keep him from getting the championship. I think there's been some timing issues, but before the lockdowns, Edwards wasn't fighting. He was sitting on his spot. He was waiting for just the right opponent. It was unfortunate with the eye poke with Bilal Muhammad. And then the Nate Diaz fight, which at this point in Nate's career, he's not in the top 10. He's not in the top 15 of the division. And Leon fought, he ends up fighting like a robot. And it's difficult for fans to get passionate and want to defend the guy when he has so little emotion in the way he fights, particularly when a guy has a big advantage. You want to see the resolution. It doesn't feel as much like a win if you completely dominate the striking and then 15 or 25 minutes later they have to read the decision. So Edwards hasn't done himself any favors in the media or even in the way he approaches fights. He's pretty much the kind of guy that he's going to need all the right things to fall in place so that he pretty much has to be given a title shot. Then he has to win and never lose it because he's not big business for the UFC, and doesn't seem to be. He's been in the UFC now long enough, and they've been trying to build his credibility. He just doesn't connect with the fans, or the fans don't connect with him, and that's too bad. I think he's a pretty shy guy, and it's difficult for him, and probably he feels a little bit like Demetrius Johnson. Well, my job is to go out there and fight. Well, that's part of your job, but part of it is also to engage the fan base, because they're the ones that pay your salaries and keep the lights on. Earl says, excuse his French, but Aljo's a bit of a bitch. Sorry. Yeah, I think people get that. They get that from Aljo. He takes a lot of back steps in a fight, both literally and in the way he goes about it. But, Damian Maia, other than that brief period when he first, when he went to 185, or when he first came to 170, he fancied himself a striker, but that was only about a 2 or 3 fight span. The rest of the time, he did whatever it took to get the fight to a position that was advantageous for him. I think if Aljo handled himself a little differently, he would make more inroads with the fans. It's difficult when your persona is brash and real showy, and then you go in there and you avoid the more typical parts of the fight. and only want it, and you want to play a specialty role. Makes it difficult. But a day after the fight, I think Aljo, well, he did a lot to impress me. Was it the most fun fight to watch? No, but Jan had a role in that as well. Right. A couple of the other fights that were of interest. Mackenzie Dern versus Tecia Torres. I was surprised that the line wasn't wider. Dern was just a minus 120 favorite to Torres plus 100 comeback. I felt like we really should understand exactly who Tecia Torres is. She's been in the UFC long enough now. She has, 14 fights in the UFC, 13-5 overall, 9-5 in the UFC. I think we know her ceiling and we know her basement. There's a certain level of fighter that Ticia's always going to find a way to win. And then at the very top, she has shown that she just doesn't have enough she doesn't have enough. She's got speed. She's got pretty good ring IQ. She's got, usually has good game plans, but she has no way to keep people off her. She doesn't have enough power to keep the other fighter honest, and she doesn't have quite enough grappling if she's going against a serious grappler. So that's why in fights with Rose Namajunas and was it Carla Esparza, I'm trying to remember, you saw that was the high water mark for Tecia Torres. For Mackenzie Dern, to me, this was a perfect fight, and she's been a revelation. So I was, very suspicious when she first came into the UFC. She seemed pretty ambivalent about how good she wanted to be. Then she had that damn baby, and she's been the bionic woman ever since. She still got a loss during that time period, but she couldn't make weight, a weight class up, 10 pounds heavier. And when she did, it was torturous to watch her do so. Now, I think they said she lost 50% of her body fat from where she was 3 years ago, pre-baby. That to me is amazing. Something in her life is headed in the right direction. And it seems like family and having a husband and a baby has really given her structure, perhaps, that she needed. And now she's able to put 100% into the fight game. Training with Jason Perillo has helped, harnessing her natural power for 115-pound division. She's got decent power in her hands. And this fight proved to be, I thought it would be a pass or fail event for her. If she needed to be able to get past Tecia, and she was able to do that. It ended up being a split decision, which I thought was a little bit odd. But Dern does have a long way to go before she's going to be able to reliably compete with the very, very top, the top 2 or 3 fighters, 3 at this point. She's going to have to get her striking under control, learn to change the power of strikes. Not everything has to be thrown at full power, setups, but she seems to be heading in the right direction and has a good coach that should get her there as well. So I felt that Tecia Torres was an excellent measuring stick. And, now we know a little bit more about Dern, and she's serious, and it certainly seems to be sticking around. And at this point, she's not on the rocket ship to the top, so she has time to develop. She's ranked 5 now. Let's see how the next title fight goes. Namajunas, if she comes out victorious, that would be an interesting matchup, but I'd like to see Dern get one more fight before that. Back to the questions. And if you've asked a question in the chat and I didn't get to it yet, try to make it concise and ask it again, because I'm not always able to read everything as it's coming through, and then it's difficult to grab. Going back. Michael Howell says, Dana thinks Sterling lost. Yeah, I think it's reasonable. Reasonable people could think that. I thought he had, but I did catch that Dana was cool with it. Like, that was even if he thought the scorecard was wrong, it was still a legitimate win. Where disqualification, that's not good for anybody. So he took the time to make sure that Aljo was standing there, the cameras could get him, get your arms up, face forward, let me put the belt on you. So Dana took that moment. He's not upset with Aljo. And it sets up another fight with Jan, sets up a possible fight with TJ. TJ Sterling, pretty interesting fight. All right. BB, Bilal's Beak says, to be fair, he rewatched the first round and don't have a problem with giving it to Sterling. This from someone who lost a ton of money because of Sterling. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. As I said, the overall volume was so low that depending on what you give priority to, it's tough to feel too passionate about giving the round to either fighter. John Wayne says he doesn't think Khamzat was exposed. He still beat the second-ranked fighter in his 11th fight, which has never been done before. I don't think Colby can take those shots and hurt Khamzat with his hands, though. Or can Colby take those? Yeah. It was very interesting, Dana White coming out and saying that Khamzat's next fight would likely be against Colby. And maybe that's Dana's way of trying to put Colby back in his place a little bit. You know, or keep a little tighter rein on his mouth. I'd like to see the fight. I think it'd be a good one to see. It depends on how much energy Colby wants to put into it. I felt that Colby could have made a better performance out of his second fight with Usman, but he was holding energy in reserve. He wasn't being as active as he could have been. And I felt it doesn't mean that he would have beat Usman if he would have pushed harder, because pushing harder not only depletes your gas tank, which affects your defense first, but constantly going in there puts you at more risk to the counter shot. But if Colby really was, if he was 100% win or nothing, he would have put more effort into that fight. Against Chimaev, it's an even more dangerous person than Usman, in my opinion, from a striking standpoint. He's much more, even though some of his techniques aren't as slick as Usman's have become, he's much more willing to throw them, and he has a much more broken cadence than what Usman. You can tell that Usman is an excellent student because he has a very pristine rhythm and cadence to his striking repertoire. He's really picked that up in quite an amazing way, because when he was first on The Ultimate Fighter, rough. His striking was pretty rough. In fact, he pretty much never showed it. I never thought he was going to come out and end up being a guy who had some pretty smooth striking technique and effective as well. He ends up having power, which isn't as surprising because plenty of wrestlers have power. It's just whether or not they can deliver it. Chimaev isn't nearly as efficient or I hate to use the word technical, but not as textbook in his striking. You could see at times he would get himself set and he could really land that jab. Very powerful. That's what put Burns down, and that was from the southpaw stance. One thing I noticed with Chimaev, not going to be much help for Colby, though maybe, is that Chimaev was really good at defending the heavy strikes and the hooks and things that came from angles. What Burns was having the most success with was coming straight down the middle, following up a hook or a feint with something straight down the pipe. And that was, other than the hook that there was a follow-up near the fence that put Chimaev down for a minute. Most of the other truly effective striking from Burns was when he was able to get the timing right and land something straight up, a jab or a straight two right down the pipe. And if Colby's going to be effective, he's not going to be able to stay at distance, and he doesn't have the power to back Chimaev off the way Burns eventually earned that respect in the second round and rest of the fight. So Colby's in a little bit of that situation, like a lot of fighters, quite honestly. There are plenty of fighters who have a lot of talent and can put a good game plan together, but they don't have the power to keep somebody off them if the person is just willing to sell out to the pressure game. We saw that with Sterling, but he was able to use the scramble as a de facto power dissuader, if you will. So Colby wouldn't have that either, which tells me he would have to grind it out with a lot of wrestling, which that's not what we saw when Colby faced Usman 2 times. Colby settles into his striking really nicely when he's fighting when he's fighting another striker, because he's got that wrestling ace up his sleeve. That's why he was able to outstrike Masvidal across that fight. That's why he was able to have so much striking success against Robbie Lawler earlier in his career. But he's not going to have that absolute thunderous advantage of wrestling over Chimaev. I don't know who wins more of those exchanges. My guess is it's kind of like the Usman fight, where they end up canceling each other out, and neither guy wants to deplete the batteries, just being a couple rams pushing against each other for the first half of the fight. Now, Chimaev might. My guess is that Chimaev would take a section of the fight with Colby and just see how good the wrestling is from the American. Another question. Nathan Gorman says, Khabib mastered the art of making a lot of cash, not fighting the best fighters, getting out while he was on top and keeping his name in the GOAT convo. Abdul Manap would be proud. Yeah, well, I think his father, he followed his father's plan in actuality and in spirit. A lot of Khabib's money didn't come directly from his fighting. He had a lot of sponsorship and a lot of that gangster money, too, from back in the stand. Because Khabib was never able to sell pay-per-views. He only was part of one pay-per-view that did well, and that was Connor's. Khabib didn't even sell out the last time they were in Abu Dhabi, and that was a small arena. But he is very popular and very important to many regions where the UFC otherwise has difficulty making headway. And because he was so important to the UFC in that way, he opened the floodgates for a lot of Dagestani fighters, and he prepared the way even for a guy like Chimaev. We feel like as fans, we understand the guy's story a little bit because Khabib showed that role. He played that role of the Dagestani, the Caucasus, that whole region, all the stands, what it's like, the stoic, tough, old school approach to wrestling and having a hard life, made it that much easier for fans to get to know Chimaev, who actually has a good personality, who's charming in ways that are more sincere than we always got from Khabib. Sometimes Khabib could be very charming, but he was very deliberate when he would turn that on and off. And you could always see just beneath the surface with Khabib, it was not about making friends. It was not about being the most liked guy. It was he was on a bigger mission. It wasn't just about himself. It was about his family and his region. Okay. Looking at the questions. Let me run through a couple more fights, grab a few more questions, and see where the rest of the live stream goes. And I appreciate everybody showing up. I actually got locked out of my account today. I had the live stream set up, ready to go, a little ahead of time. And when I went to log in to the actual live stream, Google said, you need to verify. Which, Jesus, I can't remember. Maybe a couple years ago they asked me to do that. But, dude, 10 minutes before it's supposed to go live, now you're asking me? I get it. They're protecting people and their live stream accounts. That makes sense. But I had to go through my phone, didn't know exactly what I was doing. It took a lot longer than what I'd hoped. So I appreciate everybody sticking around for that. And we are back on the consistency kick. We will be going live again every Sunday. And I do have a couple episodes that are very close. Again, problems with equipment, but hopefully I have that solved and get those out starting this week. And I did mention earlier, I'll mention it again, that if you have a question during the week, you have something I want to check out, go ahead and call my phone. It'll go right to voicemail. Leave your message. Keep it brief. And perhaps we'll use it in an episode, or will help me create an episode. 206-276-8384. DD8 says overhand was killing Hamzat. Yeah, but later in the fight, it was definitely catching him, and he wasn't able to. I don't know if he wasn't seeing it or he was just so intent on getting his own, he wasn't giving it much consideration. A few folks have asked about Khabib's comments coming out against Colby. Why do you think Khabib felt the need to speak out against Colby? Well, I think Khabib is still the one point of contention, or the one sore spot in his career, is the fact that he stayed on the bus when Conor McGregor showed up. He, after the fact, came up with a pretty good narrative, the send location narrative. But anybody who thought about it for more than a minute realized, hey, wait a minute, you didn't need the location. The dude was literally standing in the bus in front of you. Now, as I've said, from when that happened, it would have been stupid for Khabib to get off the bus. But smart and stupid goes out the window when you're talking about these giant narratives and myths and legends that fighters try to build for themselves. And Khabib is supposed to be a guy who never backs down, who takes every challenge. He'll fight bears, he'll fight anybody. But he won't get off a bus if Conor comes to challenge him. And you also have the one shameful moment, or definitely shameful moment, is when Khabib and his buddies jumped Conor and Conor's coaching staff after the fight. I mean, they ended up going away very quickly, and lucky for Khabib, Conor nor his team never pressed charges, or Khabib would have probably not been able to come back into the country. So I think those two issues still, a lot of times I think Khabib has an interesting combination in that he has pretty thin skin. Like pretty much anything you say can offend him, but he has a very strong mind, so he doesn't allow himself to react to everything that sort of pricks his consciousness. The whole idea that Colby said something inappropriate about Jorge's kids, it never happened. Calling somebody a deadbeat dad, them sitting right there and not disagreeing with you is not the same as talking about children. So I don't like it when narratives go unchallenged. And so I think those are a couple of the reasons, those are some sensitivities that might have caused Khabib to feel like he needed to chime in. But it does seem like there should have been a bigger reason to get him to make such a specific stance when it was unnecessary, saying that nobody should fight Colby, like he's crossed some line. But that was part of what, maybe this is it, is that part of what protected Khabib from scrutiny, and there were a lot of things, particularly in his personal life, that the media, anybody who did a little research, savvy fans, a lot of things to criticize in the way Khabib leads his life. Some things in the way he ascended to get the belt. As with any fighter, there are criticisms you can make, but Khabib had that ace in the hole that he very carefully played the victim card. But he made his mother and his children and his religion, they got to be the actual victims. So he still was putting himself in the position of the hero protecting a religion that doesn't need protecting, that's been around for hundreds of years and has more than 1 billion adherents. Doesn't need Khabib to protect it. It's a stable philosophy or ideology. But Khabib was able to use that anytime he couldn't be friendly with the other guy or respectful or have his opponent. Like that's why Tony Ferguson was so difficult for Khabib, because he was completely disrespectful, but he wasn't saying something Khabib could turn around in the media the way he was able to turn around some of the things Conor said. Now, some of the things Conor said didn't need to be turned around. On their face, they were tasteless. But Conor never said anything about Khabib's religion. He pointed out that Khabib was a dork because he didn't drink. Well, that's not an insult to the guy's religion. I know plenty of Muslims that drink. So Khabib found that he was able to do that, and it kept him safe. So I wonder if he's trying to double down on that so that some of his fighters can also use sort of that theory, that philosophy to overreact to things, sort of what they call cry bullies. If you complain enough, you get your way. Well, Khabib was very sophisticated at that, and he did it sparingly. He created narratives in other ways as well. But yeah, to me, that's a very interesting question, one that would take more consideration to get closer to the bottom of it. Urina asks, says, Jan didn't have his corner because of visa issues. Talk about that, please. I think that did affect him. That's a good point, and I thought about it earlier in the week, and I didn't think about it in the writing that I did after the fight, about the Jan fight with Sterling. You think you know the game plan, and you're a rock solid, mentally strong fighter, and you think, well, I don't need to have. I know what my coaches would say, but that's the crazy thing. Is it in the fray? Once you're in the fray, it's very difficult. You can no longer observe dispassionately. You become hyper focused and myopically focused on the reality you perceive right in front of you. So you're not seeing all the things that your coaching staff can see, and you're forgetting bad habits that you've been trying to train yourself out of. But the coach is there, they see all that. So perhaps maybe after the first round, the coach says and reminds Jan, look, you need to be aggressive in these ways. You need to use more feints. You're starting to follow him too much. You're being too predictable. Whatever tendencies that they'd been working on to overcome, it's going to be at the front of the coaching staff's mind, his normal corner's mind. And he had a couple guys there from ATT. Paumpa was there. But Jan doesn't speak English, almost no English. And it's difficult to get real specifics translated in the 20 or 30 seconds you have the fighter's attention in the corner. And then the screaming from the side of the cage. So it couldn't have helped. And I would say that Aljamain was maybe 95% as good as he could be. I think there's always a little room for improvement with Aljo. He's shown that. But I think of total ability, Jan was maybe 80, 85% of what he could be, or at least what we've seen in the past. How much of that was the coaching staff not being there? How much of it was purely Sterling's approach in the fight and the success that Sterling was having? And quite honestly, people booed Sterling because of the heel turn he did after getting the disqualification victory. But I don't think anybody would deny that Peter Yan came out fighting emotionally. He was overthrowing. He was throwing to end the fight immediately. And that's not how Jan normally fights. He's pretty much the master of changing speeds. He's got a fastball. He's got a hard ball. He's got a curve. He throws a lot of change-ups. He throws a lot of things that are combinations just to keep you where he wants you. And then when the opportunity is really good, he might up the overall power a little bit, sit down a little more. But Jan typically gets his power through his technique, where early in the fight he was trying to get his power from his muscles, from his effort. And that right there is not a good sign, which perhaps goes back to the original question about him missing his normal coaches in his corner. That's one thing they might have been shouting 40 seconds into the first round. Hey, whatever their code word is, or however they talk about it when they're in the gym, cut it out. You're fighting like a maniac. Stop it. Okay. Couple more questions. DD8 says he thought maybe it was the manager Ali speaking out against Colby using Khabib's Twitters. That could be. Khabib's a lot less likely to hand over the Twitters. It's not like the rest of Ali's clients. And I thought there was an actual interview. There was a quote, in fact. But I thought it was from an interview, not from the Twitters. But I could be wrong about that. Can't wait for the videos. Your favorite YouTube creator. I appreciate that. Yeah, I can't either. As I said, they're getting closer. All right. Well, another successful Sunday MMA show. I appreciate everybody coming out. Keeping it to 90 minutes today, down from 3 hours. Now that I think I have my computer stabilized, I will be adding the new platform to run the live stream, so I'll be able to bring in a lot more graphics and segments and all of those things. If you do have any questions, comments, or ideas for things I should break down or look at or consider for an episode, find me in a DM on Twitter or Instagram, or just at me at those places. You can also write me at alpacathosaurus@yahoo.com, or call the hotline, the Newt hotline, 206-276-8384, and I will listen to all that stuff and make it a part of some of the content. I really do appreciate it. Until next week, remember, it's not supposed to be easy.
Everyone spoke about penguins. However, the questions I had were not so easily answered.
It's a land that God, if he exists, has created in anger.